My name's Dermot Duncan. Thank you very much for your presentation. On the issue of policy, I know you stood off...
On the issue of?
Policy.
Policy.
You sort of didn't specifically say that you'd endorse one policy in itself. In Australia at the moment, we're looking at domestic policy being imposed on us, such as insulation, rebates, those sorts of things. So in essence, it's a picking winners policy. And I suppose also the federal opposition is looking at a picking winners policy with a green fund that people tender to. I suppose with your experience with the acid rain abatement project, do you view that a cap and trade scheme is probably the best mechanism to let the market operate and decide what technology is the best?
Well, again, I'm going to be reluctant to make a statement about what's good for Australia, so I'll just limit it to saying what worked in the United States. The United States experience with incentive-based approaches goes back to the late 1970s with some efforts to control local air pollution by allowing sources to trade off responsibilities. And that was massively expanded in 1990 to include the big standard air pollutant, sulfur dioxide. The problem we had was called acid rain, and we were looking for a solution to it. The projections for the cost of the program before it was implemented were that it was done using the standard regulatory approaches. It would cost something between $5 and $10 billion a year to control the electric utility emissions from our, for SO2 from coal, sulfur dioxide. But when instead an incentive-based approach, cap and trade, just like what we're talking about with carbon dioxide, was implemented, the costs were only about $2 billion a year, much cheaper. The reductions were obtained much more quickly than the law mandated because the emitters went out there looking for ways to reduce their emissions and then sell the permits to somebody else that could make a profit out of it. And it's been robust. It's cut emissions faster and cheaper than anyone had expected. So then the U.S. made it its policy to kind of transfer that thinking over to greenhouse gases. So it worked for the United States. I think it can work on a global basis, but it's not the only way we control emissions. We control automobile carbon dioxide by mandating fuel economy. So it's a complex structure. Whether it's the best thing for Australia or not, well, based on the experience we have, I think it's a good thing. It's working to some extent in Europe too on CO2, but you got to make your own decisions.
Good evening. My name is Peter Payne. Look, I've always seen this issue as being very closely related to the energy supply issue. And you've got peak oil theorists who say we've already passed peak oil. You've got the IEA saying peak oil will certainly occur not later than 2020 or in the 2020s. Since the two major carbon dioxide emitters are transport and buildings primarily coming from electricity, transport from fossil fuels, primarily oil, do you see that the whole concept of facing energy depletion through oil depletion or even being replaced by algae, electricity being replaced by successful carbon capture and storage, which is more than likely to occur over the next 10 years, do you see those as being an automatic stabilizer that actually might solve or go a long way towards solving this problem for us?
Good question. I don't think it's an automatic stabilizer for the following reason. First of all, I don't believe in peak oil. I think it's a wrong framing of the problem. I think rather what will happen is that as traditional oil resources dry up, as we're seeing happen, people are starting to look at non-traditional oil. First it was drilling deeper, drilling at angles, using carbon dioxide itself to blow extra oil out of the wells. Now it's going after non-traditional oil like shale oil. In my neck of the woods, they're getting natural gas by doing rock fracturing and digging it out in places that nobody thought had any gas. So I think rather the increase in price brings out new sources, which in turn stabilizes the situation. So although the price eventually may go up, I don't see us running out of the supply. Secondly, there's enough coal underground to supply us with energy for about 300 years. And most of the carbon that's underground is coal. 5 to 10 times as much as coal than is oil or natural gas. So it's a coal problem for the long term, not an oil and natural gas problem. And what would happen eventually is they'll start making liquid fuels, fluid fuels out of coal. Carbon capture and storage, you kind of suggested it might be an automatic solution, but it's far from automatic because we don't know if it works. We don't know if the cost of putting it underground and keeping it there. And if it turns out that either it doesn't stay underground long enough in enough places, or that it's very expensive technology to implement, people aren't going to go for it. And there hasn't been a single commercial scale electric power generation carbon capture and storage project implemented yet. And it's a massive failure by the governments that they haven't gotten it together to do it. So I'm not as sanguine as you are that it'll just happen. I wish it would.
Oh, thank you. I enjoyed your talk tonight. I've got a question that's a little bit controversial, and often I bring it up and it causes great debate. But I think we can pretty clearly ascertain that what your talk was saying tonight and what climate science suggests, that climate change is indeed caused by anthropogenic means. It's human-induced. And so my question for you is, how do you think we can, as a world, and what sort of policy should be looked at in terms of childbirth? What can we do to kind of keep our population down?
Well, it's a fair question. The ultimate drivers of all of this are consumption and population growth. And there's a long time argument about which is the more important. At the current time, if you accept the projections into the future, it's changes in consumption patterns. Countries like China deciding they want to be like the West, the developed countries, with everybody, a lot of people driving cars, for instance. Those are the patterns which dominate. But it's also true that with fewer, if we manage to stabilize the population at 9 or 10 billion, which is what the projections now are, instead of 12 or 15 billion, which is what they were when I first started getting into this problem, then the job is a lot easier. It's obviously you can spread the goodies more easily among fewer people. Now, I want to say that one reason I haven't emphasized the population problem is that it's a sort of an ironic twist that in some sense, and a lot of people wouldn't agree with me, in some sense the population story is more successful than the rest of the greenhouse gas story. The projected growth in population has slowed. The reason for that is complex. There is no single answer. A lot of it has to do with programs that were specifically aimed at family planning. A lot of it has to do with women's rights and empowering women and healthcare programs aimed at women. The idea that you didn't have to have 10 children to guarantee that 1 or 2 of them would survive into your old age has been a powerful factor apparently in changing patterns, so that fertility rates are down in most of the world, and seriously down, although some would say not far enough. So that while I kind of agree with you that the lower we stabilize the population at, the better off we are, I think a continuation of serious, I think these are decisions that aren't just governmental decisions, because you don't want governments telling people what the size families they have. They're sort of cultural decisions that can be assisted by government and that we are in the middle of an evolution on. So I am more sanguine that population, I won't say exactly will take care of itself, but it will become the less important part of the problem, and that consumption is where the real issue is, and not just consumption crudely measured, but high energy, high greenhouse gas abating consumption. I think there is a way to not exactly have our cake, consume our cake and eat it too, but to do what we do in a greener way.
Do we really have the political structures in order to bring on the sorts of changes you're talking about? When most of the world's economies these days are democracies, they work on 3-year terms or 4-year terms. They're not going to bite the bullet and close a coal mine if it means jobs in a particular electorate. It just doesn't seem to me that the political structure is there to be able to produce the sorts of changes we need.
You might be right. This is an experiment. We've never had to deal with such a pervasive, complex problem that reaches so deeply into the economies. We're going to have to evolve the domestic and international organizational structures and the political will to do it. But, it's part of the sort of the human adventure to continually grapple with one thing after the other. The thing I keep coming back to is, and I'm sorry if people have heard me say this before, when I was a kid growing up in New York City, they had us periodically dive under our school desks because the Russians were going to launch bombs at us. And really I and a lot of my friends just thought we'd never reach this age. But somehow the political and institutional arrangements developed in an ad hoc way at first, which allowed that what seemed like an impossible problem to solve with countries that didn't want to talk to each other and didn't have commonalities, we thought, to actually reach agreement and find ways to change not only their international relations, but their domestic views on what the other countries was like. So maybe I'm a stupid optimist, but I think it can be done. And I think this problem is as big and complicated and threatening as that one. Maybe not quite as threatening, but it's threatening enough. And it will be interesting to see. I think it can be done. I don't know what to say beyond that to convince you. Yes?
Professor, my name's Penny and I'm an inventor. I'm developing a new cooking system that uses way less energy. It's eco-designed, energy efficient, uses thin film technology and so on. I'm one of a myriad of people. I belong to an organisation that helps about 20 inventors, some of whom have wonderful ideas, on the smallish scale to reduce climate change. And we are finding that there is really only support in policy for government, particularly through grants and so on, for things like alternative energy, and not support for people who are endeavouring to find beautiful ways to make hydrogen, for instance, at very low cost, ways to diminish the amount of material that goes into the kitchen in every house, and so on. This also goes along with consumption. If you look at sustainability, we know that we need to reduce our pressure on the earth in terms of how much material we need, but we're all wedded to consumption. Do you think that we can change people's attitude to we need to use less?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because I may have given the impression that I think the whole thing is a technological issue, and it isn't. It's also what was loosely called a lifestyle issue. Lifestyles will change. You know, we're not going to live the same way in 100 years as we live now, even if there were no greenhouse problem. I believe in, ultimately, the incredible flexibility of human beings. And I think we are capable of making changes when necessary. And we've done so. I mean, there's a whole list of things that humans do because they realized that it was bad to keep doing what they were doing. Smoking is always the standard thing that's pointed to. I don't know. Do people smoke in Australia? It doesn't seem to. In the U.S., they don't anymore, in general. So, so it's been a very lively discussion of how to initiate those kinds of changes. And I don't have an answer. There's, literature, huge numbers of papers are written. It goes to the issue, Sam, that you mentioned about how this is a social issue. It's not just a scientific issue. And we're going to learn a lot about that. And I think over time it will prove that, once this problem does get the political willpower behind it, I think people will start to realize what they're doing that needs to be done differently. And, as I said, humans are quite flexible. And I think if they realize the challenge, they will live up to it and they will find a way to deal with it. And, economic incentive is powerful. Again, I'll refer to the example of China. China is getting a lead in several alternative energy areas. And one reason they're doing that, it's good for the Chinese economy, but there's a dynamic that gets underway there because once they've done it, China as a state has an interest in other countries reducing their emissions because they can sell the equipment to the other countries, and it makes international agreements easier. Well, it's a similar thing at the individual level. Once there's kind of a view that these new technologies have to be adopted to save the planet, you will see more people finding ways to make their own lives malleable enough so they can live in a world, for instance, where you don't have to drive everywhere at all times. I know that's a little hard to grasp here as it is in the United States, but I see that as a possibility. I just can't give you the roadmap for getting there.
Presentation, Professor. I want to ask a question. Probably already very old question to ask. It's about the parallelization. How do we prioritize our tasks since there are so many problems we're facing? Like Lundberg pointed out, we're facing probably malaria, but now we have global warming. So since there are too many problems to face, how different countries should prioritize their tasks when facing those problems?
Are you asking what priority should a country that's got a lot of other difficulties give to global? Well, I think what you do is you look for ways to solve more than one problem at a time. For instance, I'll go back to China, which is a fascinating case. China kind of made a decision a couple of years ago that global warming was worth paying attention to, partly because it saw it as a threat. No country is going to do anything just to be nice guys. They have to realize that it's in their self-interest to pay attention. But when they did that, they didn't sort of revolutionize what they were doing. They also had an interest in doing something from a technological point of view because they were worried about their growing use of energy and their dependence on foreign sources of energy, as many countries are. In fact, their dependence on Australian coal, for instance. They have a nasty air pollution problem, and they want to put a lid on the amount of coal that they're ultimately going to burn. They don't have enough infrastructure. They can't build railroads fast enough to get the coal around the country. So all these things kind of conspire to move them in the direction of having a more proactive greenhouse gas policy. In some countries, that'll be, it'll be obvious what needs to be done, and greenhouse gases controlling greenhouse gases can move smoothly with a number of other policy initiatives. Same thing in my country. The energy independence issue is important. The air pollution issue is important. We can sort of solve three things at once. In other countries, it's much less important than a bunch of other things that are going to happen. But even in the poorest countries, the cost of energy is a big deal. So finding ways to not be so dependent on heavily energy-intensive industries, for instance, is a good thing to be doing. So that you do the cheap and easy things, like you make things more efficient to begin with. In countries that really can't afford to do that, they're going to require help from outside. So, you look for the opportunities is what the answer to the question is. And there is progress already being made by countries that are taking that attitude.
Please allow me to add it up to my question again, up to you said, because that's exactly what people are thinking, because since the cost is too high and there's a great uncertainty, people started thinking maybe malaria is easier to solve. Like people in Africa are suffering so much, and people start to think maybe we should try to solve that problem first, put on our priority top list.
Well, there's no doubt about it. In the real world, things get in the way. Look at my country. Again, we have a couple of other problems, like the problems with the financial system to straighten out before we're actually going to get to doing greenhouse gases, at least legislatively. But in the meantime, quietly and on the back burner, the government is putting extra constraints, forcing higher levels of energy efficiency, developing new energy sources. So while climate may not be in the front burner in the United States, there are still things being done. In poorer countries, it's somewhat more difficult. That, again, it's going to need a cooperative effort with some resources flowing from the rich countries to the poor countries.
We're already over time, and I notice people are leaving. So 2 more questions. I think there's been some people waiting quite a while over here. So,
I just wanted to ask you very briefly about the geoengineering option that's often put around. I realise that can go the whole gamut from painting your roofs white to erecting an enormous floating orbital sunscreen to keep the Earth's temperature cool. Now, I'm not too keen on them myself, but I was interested in, do you think those would be a viable way in an extreme situation where we had to solve the problems quickly? Could you see some countries, perhaps unilaterally, stepping forward and trying to push those sorts of solutions, and would they work?
For people who aren't aware of this, there have been proposals to engineer the climate, and they're of, as you said, they're of a different variety. The kind I'll focus on now are proposals which would reduce the amount of sunlight coming into Earth in order to counteract the warming. And the question is, number one, are those viable approaches? And number two, is it possible that a country on its own would go out and engineer something? And one way this is done is by launching particles into the stratosphere where they reflect sunlight. The studies of these climate engineering systems that have been done suggest that while you can offset the overall global warming at a modest cost, The other climate changes that accompany global warming are not offset. So, for instance, by launching particles, you can reflect enough sunlight so that the global average temperature goes back down, but you don't offset the changes in the energy distribution of Earth, which, say, can kill the monsoon season, which would be devastating. So I personally am very skeptical of those approaches, and I think what needs to be done is a very significant, in the $10 million a year range, very significant research program, not going out and firing anything into the atmosphere, which I think is too dangerous, but computer modeling to try to get us to learn more. So I think we need to relax about it and take 20 years or so to figure out whether it would work or not in a relatively harmless way, or whether it's worse than the threat that it's trying to avoid. As far as whether a country would ever launch these things on their own, I kind of doubt it, because unless computer modeling gets a lot better, we can't predict what an intervention would do to any one country very well. So I think the risk that you'd cause a bad effect in your country is probably high enough to deter countries from actually thinking they could benefit that way.
Thanks. I want to ask you about the hole in the ozone layer, which we heard a lot about up until about a decade ago. And we seem to have had some success because it disappeared. I was wanting you to comment on that success, whether that gives you reason to believe that we can achieve success with the current issues, and whether or not closing the hole has amplified the effects of greenhouse gases.
Yeah, dealing with ozone depletion has proven to be a success story. The ozone layer appears to be just sort of maxing out and about to go into a healing phase because of the controls that were instituted starting in about 1990 to reduce the emissions of the ozone-depleting gases. There are some lessons that can be learned from the international framework called the Montreal Protocol, which was effective in getting countries to cooperate. One lesson is there was a big pot of money to help developing countries like China to not get on their own production of those ozone-depleting chemicals and to start using the new ones as coolants in refrigerators, for instance. And number two, there were trade sanctions in that agreement so that if the developing countries that didn't yet have the production capacity of the ozone-depleting chemicals decided to develop it, that none of the signatory countries would have bought their products. So that tells you that it would be interesting to have an agreement which had both carrots and sticks in it to help countries want to do the right thing. Where the analogy breaks down is simply that we're talking about one class of chemicals and an industry that was worth about $30 billion globally. Here we're talking about something that penetrates the whole economic system. It's a much more complex problem to solve. There is no simple technological fix. So, within reason, we can learn some things from that experience.